popular article in Aeon magazine. It's called "The Disruption Nexus." Moments of crisis such as our own are great opportunities for historic change, but only under highly specific conditions. By Roman Krznaric, social philosopher. Yeah, so out of Oxford. But yeah, I was just about to read this, and don't be sorry you're late. As I was just saying, you don't owe me your time. You don't. I don't owe you my time. I mean, I stream and I like to do it, but you don't owe me nothing. Okay, so here we go. And as always, I'm going to read this. Let's see what it's about, and we'll review it at the end. Okay. Polycrisis, metacrisis, omnicrisis, permacrisis. Call it what you like. We are immersed in an age of extreme turbulence and interconnected global threats. The system is starting to flicker. Chronic droughts, melting glaciers, far-right extremism, AI risk, bioweapons, rising food and energy prices, rampant viruses, cyber attacks. Yeah. So everything's horrible and scary. I don't know if I buy this. Things were shitty in the past too. And it's just like, we fooled ourselves into thinking things were good for a little while, but really were they, and how long were they actually that good for? I'm not sure. So the idea that like things are scarier now may just be that we are more aware of it, but I don't know if it's actual, like this has a basis in reality. But like, yeah, people say this sort of thing. The ultimate question hanging over us is whether these multiple crises will contribute to civilization breakdown, or whether humanity will successfully rise to such challenges and bend rather than break with the winds of change. Yeah, this is like the day the world stood still. Like the old movie, and then they remade it with Keanu. Like, oh yeah, you fucked up the earth, and like aliens are coming to fuck it up, but will you rise above? Things are usually normal. I mean, that's the question, Mint. What counts as normal? Really, what counts as normal? Viper says, I buy it. The accelerating pace of innovation makes it harder to adapt. Okay, fair. I mean, but that's a different reason. Now, in the past, I'd counter with, well, the fact that we didn't have a whole lot of innovation, well, no. We had innovation. It was just at a different pace. And is it relatively different for them? Like, is the rapid change of innovation now so different from what it was back in the past? Like, relatively speaking. So, like, everybody always exists at the cutting edge of, like, history for them. They were in the most innovative times that existed for those people. So it's like they felt the same thing that we did. Now, we think that our tech is, you know, much different, but, like, is it really? What's the relative difference now from then? And I think you probably have a point, Vipers. Literal hockey stick curve? Yeah. Okay, we got, and thank you for the clip. Is that, like, funny, or is it just me cursing? Okay. Yeah. It has been commonly argued from Karl Marx to Milton Friedman to Steve Jobs that it is precisely moments of crisis like these that provide opportunities for transformative change and innovation. Or are they just selling shit? I don't know. Might it be possible to leverage the instability that appears to threaten us? Both. Okay. Not surprising. But thank you for the clip. The problem that so often crises fail to bring about fundamental system change, whether it is the 2008 financial crisis or the wildfires and floods of the ongoing climate emergency. So in this essay based on my latest book, History for Tomorrow, Inspiration from the Past for a Future of Humanity, I want to explore the conditions under which governments respond effectively to crises and undertake rapid and radical policy change. What would it take, for instance, for politicians to stop dithering and take the urgent action required to tackle global heating? Let's see. Now I want to see it. It's just like, fuck you, man, because I read 10 books and you read one doesn't mean I have to sit here and unpack your shit for you. Yeah, it's like, I am not responsible for other people's stupidities. I'm not. And so the idea that, like, other people feel that they are entitled to my time, no. Yeah. Yeah, it's like, yeah. Like, no. You do not get my time. I don't care. Okay, yeah, so are we gonna... I like how they say global heating, not global warming. Maybe that's just a little bit more scary. We're getting heated up, not warmed up. Getting hot. Alright. Author's motives stem from a palpable sense of frustration. Around 2 decades decades ago when I first began to grasp the scale of the climate crisis. So that would be 2 decades ago, is like 2004 for any of you old folks out there like me. Especially after reading Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, I thought that if there were just a sufficient number of climate disasters in a short space of time, like hurricanes hitting Shanghai and New York in the same week as the River Thames flooded central London, then we might wake up to the crisis. But in the intervening years, I've come to realize I was mistaken. There are simply too many reasons for governments not to act, from the lobbying power of the fossil fuel industry to the pathological fear of abandoning the goal of everlasting GDP growth. Yeah, we're the frogs, Latvian Jesus. We are. This sent me on a quest to search history for broad patterns of how crises bring about substantive change. What did I discover? That agile and transformative crises responses have usually occurred in 4 contexts: war, disaster, revolution, and disruption. I mean, I understand war, disaster, and revolution. What is a disruption? That doesn't mean anything to me. Before delving into these and offering a model of change I call the disruption nexus, it is important to clarify the meaning of crisis itself. Let's get one thing straight from the outset. John F. Kennedy was wrong when he said that the Chinese word for crisis is composed of 2 characters meaning danger and opportunity. The second character, G, is actually closer to meaning change point or critical juncture. This makes it similar to the English word crisis, which comes from the ancient Greek crisis, whose verb form krino meant to choose, decide at a critical moment. In the legal sphere, for example, a crisis was a crucial decision point when someone might be judged guilty or innocent. The meaning and application of this concept has evolved over time. For Thomas Paine, in the 18th century, a crisis was a threshold moment when a whole political order could be overturned and where a fundamental moral decision was required, such as whether or not to support the war for American independence. Karl Marx believed capitalism experienced inevitable crises which could result in economic and political rupture. More recently, Malcolm Gladwell has popularized the idea of a tipping point, a similar moment of rapid transformation or contagion in which a system undergoes large-scale change. In everyday language, we use the term crisis to describe an instance of intense difficulty or danger in which there is an imperative to act, whether it is a crisis in a marriage or the planetary ecological crisis. Overall, we can think of a crisis as an emergency situation requiring a bold decision to go in one direction rather than another. So what wisdom does history offer for helping us to understand what it takes for governments to act boldly and effectively in response to a crisis? You know, I'm wondering what counts as being bold, because a lot of politicians say, I'm being bold, and, you know, it's really stuff as usual, like business as usual. They're not really being bold. So this is like something that this author wants. It's some sort of major change, but I'm not sure, like, it's like, what counts as bold? What counts as major for this person? I'm not entirely sure. Okay. The most common context in which governments carry out transformative and effective crisis responses is during war. Consider the United States during the Second World War. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the U.S. government instigated a seismic economic restructuring to put the country on a war footing. Despite fierce opposition from industry, there was a ban on the manufacture of private cars, and petrol was rationed to 3 gallons per week. The President Franklin D. Roosevelt increased the top rate of federal income tax to 94% by the end of the war. And you wonder why things were different back then. 94%. While the government borrowed heavily and spent more between 1942 and 45 than in the previous 150 years. And all of this state intervention was happening in the homeland of free market capitalism. Moreover, the wartime crisis prompted the U.S. to throw the political rulebook out the window and enter a military alliance with its ideological archenemy, the USSR, to defeat the common enemy. Yeah, I mean, we do not like fascist Nazis. A second context in which, things were different back then. They were. A second context in which governments take radical crisis action is in the wake of disasters. Following devastating floods in 1953, which killed almost 2,000 people, the Dutch government embarked on building a remarkably ambitious flood defense system called the Delta Works, whose cost was the equivalent of 20% of GDP at the time. Wow, that's a lot, 20%. No government today is doing anything close to this in response to the climate crisis, not even in the Netherlands, where 1/4 of the country is below sea level and flooding has been a critical threat for centuries. The COVID-19 pandemic provides another example. In response to the public health emergency, Britain's ruling Conservative Party introduced a series of radical policy measures that would be generally considered inconceivable by a centre-right government. They shut schools and businesses, closed the borders, banned sports events and air travel, poured billions into vaccination programs, and even paid the salaries of millions of people for more than a year. It was absolutely clear to them that this was a problem that markets would be unable to solve. The reality is that climate emergency is the wrong kind of crisis. Interesting. All right. Yeah, I mean, I think this is it. It's like the problem that the markets would be unable to solve. So if you don't think that the market is able to do certain things, even as a conservative, then you have to preserve the market. So it's like, that's the issue. I mean, this is one of the problems that people cannot get out of, like, their view of, like, the world the way it is right now. And so the conservatives, I feel, are more afraid of the market disappearing than they are for the people. And so they have to do what they need to do to preserve the market. And in that case, in this one instance, it meant saving the people. Okay. A third category of rapid transformative change is in the context of revolutions, which can generate upheavals that create dramatic openings in the political system. The Chinese Communist Party, for instance, introduced a radical land redistribution program during the Civil War in the late 1940s and following the Revolution of 1949, confiscating agricultural property from wealthy landlords and putting it in the hands of millions of poor peasant farmers. Most people don't even know the difference between markets and capitalism. No, I mean, you need to actually have some, like, political background to understand these terms, and most people do not. Like, that's fair. I mean, capitalism is a, like, economic system, and then there's still markets in other, like, systems. Like, you can still have markets. Like, yeah. Like, that has nothing to do with the capitalism that basically says, with money, then you get to decide. So, anyway. Sometimes, and thankfully. Okay. Similarly, the Cuban Revolution of 1959 provided an opportunity for Fidel Castro's regime to launch the Cuban National Literacy Campaign. In early 1961, more than 250,000 volunteers were recruited, 100,000 under the age of 18, and more than half of them women, to teach 700,000 Cubans to read and write. Capitalism is superstructure, it's the how and why. Yeah, yep. It was one of the most successful mass education programs in modern history. Within a year, national literacy had been reduced from 24% to just 4%. Yeah, see, that's a great thing for people to be able to read. Whatever your views on Castro's Cuba, there's no doubt that revolutions can drive radical change. But I mean, that's like the definition of revolution in itself. Oopsie, sorry. It's fine. You can put Y's in for I's. It's all good. These three contexts, war, disaster, and revolution, help explain the overwhelming failure of governments to take sufficient action on a crisis such as climate change. The reality is that it is the wrong kind of crisis and doesn't fit neatly into any of these three categories. I mean, I hate this sentence. I mean, this is like they defined these categories and then said, well, the climate crisis doesn't fit there. It's like, well, okay, but you defined them. Why are they the only ones? Like, I don't like this. They're going to say other stuff, but I just, like, take issue there. It is not like war with a clearly identifiable external enemy. It is not taking action in place of the wake of a revolutionary moment that could inspire transformative action, and it doesn't even resemble a crisis like the Dutch floods of 1959. In that case, the government acted only after the disaster, having ignored years of warnings from water engineers. In fact, unrealized plans for the Delta Works already existed, whereas today we ideally need nations to act before more ecological disasters hit, and we cross irreversible tipping points of change. Prevention rather than cure is the only safe option. And this is part of the issue. Prevention is something that we do not do well in Western philosophy. Our notion of healthcare is always reactive. It's been this way for a long time. I think the Chinese philosophy of medicine handles it better. But like in the West, being healthy is basically the lack of pain. And when we're in pain or there's a problem, then Western medicine acts. But this is our mentality about this, and I don't think it's good. Surely he's defining them by looking at historical precedent. Yeah, that's right, Vipers. And like, this is why I say it's like it's okay, but again, like, you could be cherry picking stuff. And so if I mean, I expect that people in chat understand what he's talking about, but again, you could be like cherry picking the examples to exclude climate change. Maybe things did happen in the past that people acted upon, but it's just the style of argumentation allows for cherry picking to happen, and there's no counterbalance to say, well, what about all these other things? An ounce of weed is worth a pound of cure. Exactly. So, but like, yeah, you're like, I don't think there's a problem with what he said. I just don't like this style of reasoning here, and like, this is more on me than I don't think like the author is anything particularly bad. It's just something I gripe about, and I think but you can see, like, it would be a problem. Like, say, well, look at these 3 examples, and then this 4th example is not like those 3. It's like, yeah, but did it happen in history also? And they're saying, well, all that never happened in history. Slightly, yeah. So it could have been an issue. I don't think it is. Okay. Author continues. Does that mean there is little hope of governments taking urgent action in response to a crisis like ecological emergency or other existential threats? Is human civilization destined to break rather than successfully bend in the face of such critical challenges? Fortunately, there is a 4th crisis context that can jumpstart radical policy change: disruption. And you can see right here, maybe the whole thing was a setup to say, well, I have the answer. But you can see also, what the fuck is disruption? They're making some term up here. And this is like, okay, this was, the previous sections were kind of a setup, and now they get their preferred answer. That may also be fine, but I'm pointing out the setup at this point. Okay, what the author says, by disruption, I am referring to a moment of system instability that provides opportunities for rapid transformation, which is created by a combination or nexus of 3 interlinked factors. Some kind of crisis, though typically not as extreme as war, revolution, or cataclysmic disaster, which combines with disruptive social movements and visionary ideas. These 3 elements are brought together in a model I have developed called the disruption nexus. See graphic? Here is how it works. So crisis, political, economic, tech, or some other ideas. Ideas have worldviews of policies that reshape society, movements, disruptive movements. Okay. Yeah, TM. Well, they are selling a book, Chocolate Mint. So this is disruption nexus. Rapid transformative changes most likely to happen when a crisis occurs in conjunction with disruptive movements and visionary ideas permeating society. None of them alone is sufficient. Yeah, okay, so what they're doing is they're taking a mix of all the other big ones and saying, well, all of that stuff can happen together. Yeah. Hey, Valpo, how you doing? Yeah, we're just reading this thing out from Aeon magazine. So, you know, Philosopher wrote a book, and now they wrote a popular article on it, and I'm giving them shit for no good reason. Let's build a fire, yeah. So, let's begin with the top corner of the triangular diagram I labeled crisis. The model is based on a recognition that most crises, such as the 2008 financial meltdown or the recent droughts in Spain, are rarely in and of themselves sufficient to induce rapid and far-reaching political change, unlike a war. Rather, the historical evidence suggests that a crisis is most likely to create substantive change if 2 other factors are simultaneously present: movements and ideas. Yeah, so if you've got enough unrest in different areas, then the whole thing can move. So yeah. Social movements play a fundamental role in processes of historical change. Typically, they do this through amplifying crises that may be quietly simmering under the surface or that are ignored by dominant actors in society. As Naomi Klein writes in her book, This Changes Everything, quote, slavery wasn't a crisis for British and American elites until abolitionism turned it into one. Racial discrimination wasn't a crisis until the civil rights movement turned it into one. Sex discrimination wasn't a crisis until feminism turned it into one. Apartheid wasn't a crisis until the anti-apartheid movement turned it into one. Her view, end quote, her view, which I think is absolutely right, is that today's global ecological movement needs to do exactly the same thing and actively generate a sense of crisis, so the political class recognizes that climate change is a crisis worthy of a Marshall Plan levels of response. Okay, so The only answer here is that the people in power have to be afraid. They have to be afraid of losing being in power. That's what a war is. That's what like massive ecological like flooding will do. Is that the people in power have to have a fire under their ass, like Chocolate Mint is saying, and basically they have to be afraid for their own lives, and that will do it. So you can do that in multiple ways. It can be war, because then you've got an external threat that's going to come for their heads anyway. You can do it like with the natural disasters, because people won't put up with corrupt government officials that don't do anything if everyone's dying, or whatever else they were saying earlier. Or you could do it like through this like social movement, like enough troubles as is will force them to get off their asses. We can prevent crises by repressing movements. Yeah, but only for so long. I mean, maybe you're going to get by for a while, but eventually what happens is you have to repress more and more people. And then eventually, and I don't know when, but it takes a long time, but you're not going to be able to be in power forever. And it says, I get the author's point and agree, but lately everything is a freaking crisis because things are systemic, and also people dramatize too much to get attention, so real crises get overlooked. Yeah. And like this is the other thing. It's like nowadays we've got manufactured crises too. And so that's sometimes it's just distraction run by elites. Sometimes it's like, well, people are just trying to get their pet project recognized. And so they're like, manufacturing crisis around it. So it's like, I agree with this author, but I'm not like buying their like overall, like, is this really anything special here? Okay. So continuing though. Multiple historical examples, which I have explored in detail in my book, History for Tomorrow, and where you can find a full list of references, bear out this close relationship between disruptive movements and crisis. Okay, so yes, social movements work. If you like, social movements plus some sort of instigating event will actually cause change. Good to know. But like, yeah, again, cherry picking history or just sort of like, building an argument for themselves. You decide how you want to understand what they're saying here. Either way, it's not a big deal. And it says Notre Dame burnt down around the same time there was a huge fires in Brazilian Amazon. Guess how much money was raised for Notre Dame in a matter of days, and how nobody gave a damn about the fucking real Amazon. Yeah, I mean, but the Amazon, we have all Notre Dame, we have all these pretty pictures of. We need Notre Dame. It's like, yeah. So, but yeah. That's too bad. I forgot about the Amazon. Yeah. Okay. I forgot about Notre Dame, to be fair, too. Oxygen helps. Yeah. Well, fire requires oxygen. Oxygen, yeah. Okay. But Western culture is important. No, European culture is what matters. Yeah. Well, one of these days we're going to have to worry about the trees, too. I mean, that's kind of what the nature is. We're going to have to start worrying more about trees and the oceans and things like that. I mean, there's the old quote, it's like, only after the last tree has been cut down and the last fish has been caught, only then will you realize that you can't eat money. So, like, that's, like, something else matters. Yeah. Okay. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 in Britain provides a case in point. There was certainly a generalized sense of political crises in the country in the early 1830s. Urban radicals were pressuring the government to widen the electoral franchise, and impoverished agricultural workers had risen up in the Captain Swing riots. On top of this, anti-slavery activists were continuing their decades-long struggle. More than 700,000 people remained enslaved on British-owned sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Yet their largely reformist strategy, such as holding public meetings and distributing pamphlets, was still not enough to tip the balance against the powerful slave-owning lobby. The turning point came in 1831 in an act of disruption and defiance that created shockwaves in Britain. The Jamaican slave revolt. Okay, so the slaves had to literally go die in order to, get this set off. And this is being treated as a work of disruption. Like, this is war for the Jamaicans, though. They were out for their own lives. That's what it sounds like. The slaves were, that's war to them. And from the British side, it's like, wow, we've been disrupted. It's like, I don't quite like this sort of gloss of history. Like, from the slave side, I don't see this as a disruption. I see this as an act of war. They were, warring for their lives. Okay, more than 20,000 slave workers rose up in rebellion, setting fire to more than 200 plantations. The revolt was crushed, but their actions sent a wave of panic through the British establishment, who concluded that if they did not grant emancipation, then the colony could be lost. Yeah, so this is an act of war. They were afraid that the colony would be lost. See, this is why I'm annoyed with their gloss. Name of the song, please. I don't know the name of the song, but this is the link. Congratulations, Kadir. Level 90, that's good. You didn't know of the Jamaican one? I think of Haiti. Yeah, I didn't know of it either. Okay. Yeah, as the historian David Olusoga points out, apologize how I say your name, Olusoga points out in Black and British 2016, the Jamaican Rebellion was the final factor that tipped the scales in favor of abolition. In the absence of this disruptive movement, it might have taken decades longer for abolition to enter the statute books. See, yeah, disruptive movement from the Brit side. This is a colony could be lost and war on the Jamaicans' part. So, I mean, it's a matter of perspective there. Another case concern of the granting of the vote to women, right to vote to women in Finland in 1906. During the political crises of the general strike in 1905, an uprising against Russian imperialism in Finland, the Finnish women's movement took advantage of the situation by taking the streets along with the trade unionists. Yeah. The League of Working Women, part of the growing social democratic movement, staged more than 200 public protests for the right of all women to vote and run for office, mobilizing tens of thousands of women in mass demonstrations. By magnifying the existing crisis, they were able to finally overcome the parliamentary opposition to female suffrage. Again, uprising against Russian imperialism in Finland. There was already war going on, and the people in power were like, we're going to lose this war if those people get together. More recently, the mass popular uprisings in Berlin in November 1989 amplified the political crisis that had been brewing over previous months, with turmoil in East German government and destabilizing pro-democracy protests having taken place across the Eastern Bloc, partly fueled by the reforms of the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Their actions made history on 9 November when the Berlin Wall was finally breached and the system itself visibly came tumbling down. In all of the above cases, however, a third element alongside the movement and crisis was required to bring about change: the presence of visionary ideas. Okay, so this is something new that they've added, so that's fair. Now we're getting somewhere. In Capitalism and Freedom, 62, the economist Milton Friedman wrote that while a crisis is an opportunity for change, when that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. From a different perspective, Hannah Arendt argued that a crisis was a fruitful moment for questioning orthodoxies and established ideas, as it brought about the ruin of our categories of thought and standards of judgment, and that such traditional verities seem no longer to apply. Yeah, and these are good points. When things are changing, you get an opportunity to look at the world a different way because what was there is no longer there, or at least not in the same way. So this is fair. So that when one thing's happen, like nothing just happens in a vacuum. When there is a war or political change or anything else, you get to think about other stuff too. Like it just is like it comes along whole hog because our ideas are all related to each other. I mean, it's just how we think. We think, well, not everything is just like, sectioned off into different areas. Like we're not only thinking in silos. Latvian says, I feel like this is most arguing that the only meaningful change is one that comes from action in a huge crisis, but what about the idea of everyday revolution? Think about the kinds of relationships you want to see in the world by simply practicing those relations in your quotidian life. Yeah, I mean, this is talking about political change, so how much political change does actually happen in our everyday life? I mean, yes, this is how political movements start. This is what they're talking about. But they're saying about if you're looking at like governmental change, where you're talking about like political systems and political acts that need to like really happen. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't know. You can be the change you want to see in the world, but is that going to change the government on its own? Probably not. I mean, we're just one person is not going to like overthrow the government. You'd need a whole lot to go with it. So, I mean, it just seems like it's too far away, Latvian. And says historical materialism based on the idea of crises in the system that provoke dialectical change. Yeah, so that sort of whole sort of dialectic at the level of political systems, and that's how these things operate. It's like, yeah, that's a whole political stuff, and I don't know enough about that really. And says, yeah, I agree with this. Macro politics should be based on political culture of individual ethical behavior, but what you mean is individual important. Yeah, so like we're not going to make any grand change without figuring out how we want to live, like interpersonally, like individually. But that will take a lot of us deciding to live differently to eventually change the government too. Latvian says, I think that greases the wheels. These personal practices are what make big events realizable. Yeah, I think we're agreeing at this point. You need like on the ground change to make a movement to get like bigger political change. And I don't think there's too much argument with that. Okay. Dominant old ideas are in a state of flux and uncertainty, and fresh ones are potentially ready to take their place. In these three historical examples, disruptive ideas around racial equality, women's rights, and democratic freedoms were vital inspiration for the success of transformational movements. Yeah, I mean, if you want people to go out there and die, they have to feel like they're doing something worth their life. So it's like that requires some sort of rather potent concepts, like potent ideas to get people to lay their life on the line. Otherwise, people are like, I'm not dying for this stupid shit, because people aren't going to waste their life on some stupid shit. Like, if you want like to get like martyrs, you have to promise them heaven, or you have to promise, like, you have to be like doing something that you think is going to make revolutionary change. But those are conceptual things. Those are big ideas. So like, yeah. The 2008 financial crash illustrates what happened in the absence of unifying ideas. Two corners of the triangle were in place: the crisis of the crash itself and the Occupy movement calling for change. What was missing, though, were the new economic ideas and models to challenge the failing system, exemplified by the Occupy slogan, Occupy everything, demand nothing. So they're saying this is the failure. I think there's a bit more complicated, but okay. The result was that the traditional power brokers and the investment banks managed to get themselves bailed out, and the old financial system remained intact. This would be less likely to happen today when new economic models such as donut economics, degrowth, and modern monetary theory have gained far more public prominence. Yeah, maybe, but I mean, it's like, so in the absence of good ideas back then, we couldn't see any way forward, so we just like retreated to the old ideas? Maybe. Like, maybe that's plausible. I don't know about this. Vipers wrote about this, Dennett wrote about this, ideas to die for. Yeah, that's fair. He did talk about this stuff. And says, I agree, but they're still based on your personal decision to do those things. Guiding society as a whole is way more complicated because not everyone thinks the same way you do, sadly, yeah. Latvian says, yeah, I suppose I was irked by one of the macro-micro politics being the assumed political change. There isn't, thank you for the shout out to Anne. There isn't a default between the two. They're unique and useful in their own ways and how they play with each other. Yeah. Yep. Okay, so saying if we had some different thing, the banks would have been like in a much more dangerous position. And that's possible, that if we start to think there were alternatives to ways that they were doing stuff, then we might have forced them to do things different. But what actually counts as a real alternative? Sadly, the banks are usually the ones that come up with this shit. And so, like, whatever they're doing, they're still in power. Chocolate says maybe give credit unions a larger role. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, who gets the money? And the chances are the people who are economically in charge are just shifting around their own money. So it's not, I'm not even buying that this is, like, really going to do anything. And it says a political culture influences individual behavior. The problem is that people are super disconnected from their sense of community. Individualism is the rule too. Yeah, and you can see people, like politicians, like to stoke this because they know that if people aren't organized together, then they won't disrupt the status quo. And with modern capitalism blamed for all this, yeah. Yep. Okay. All right, so author continues. Is the disruption nexus a watertight theory of historical change? Absolutely not. There are no iron laws in laws of history, no universal patterns that stand outside space and time. I'm a firm believer in the statistician George Box's dictum that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Several caveats are worth noting. I'm certainly not claiming that transformative change will always take place if all three elements are the disruption nexus are in place. Sometimes the power of the existing system is simply too entrenched. That's why the US peace activists were unable to stop the Vietnam War in the 1960s, although they certainly managed to turn large swaths of the public against it. My argument is rather that change is most likely when all three ingredients of the nexus are present. I mean, this is fair. That if there are different sections of society that are unhappy with the government and they get together, then the government might have to move. It may not just be one overwhelming force. And some models are hot, yeah. Of course, we like hot models. Occasionally, crisis responses can come into conflict with one another, making it difficult to take effective action. In 2018, when the French government attempted to increase carbon taxes on fuel to reduce CO2 emissions, it was met with the Yellow Vest movement, which argued that the taxes were unjust given the cost of living crises that had been pushing up energy and food prices. Furthermore, at times, other factors apart from the disruptive movements or visionary ideas will come into play to help create change, such as the role of individual leadership. This was evident in the struggle against slavery, with important parts played by figures including Samuel Sharp, Elizabeth Hayrick, and Thomas Clarkson. The full story of abolition cannot be told without them. Yeah, so, again, it's we can see the really simple things like wars change stuff, and then after that it's, a combination of other stuff. So it's okay. Finally, it is vital to recognize that crises can be taken in multiple directions. The Great Depression of the 1930s may have contributed to the rise of progressive social democratic welfare states in Scandinavia, but it equally aided in the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy. When it comes to crises, be careful what you wish for. Those who desire an avalanche of crisis to kickstart change are playing with fire. Yeah, and this is what I really dislike about, there's accelerationists, I think they're called. I really dislike that because the people who die are always the poor and the ones who have no money. The rich people are going to be okay. And the accelerationists, people who want stuff to change, is the fascists are going to take over. You don't want the fascists to take over, but that's the most likely outcome if you're you want to kickstart change. The people who are going to stomp on the poor people, and they're going to stay in power. And you think you're going to be okay in the future? Probably not. Let's see. Latvian is averse to wanting to make claims about what ought to be the grander narrative of the political movement in the same way that just one person's analysis of macro politics may not account for the foibles of the individual. Yeah. Naomi Klein's work on shock culture is brilliant, especially right post 9/11. Interesting. Okay. I think this person mentioned Naomi Klein earlier, but I don't know anything about it. Okay. Perhaps the greatest virtue of the disruption nexus model, in which movements amplify crisis makes ideas relevant, and ideas inspire movements, is that it provides a substantive role for collective human agency. Okay, so now we're getting into chat discussion. So, the fact that you can have the way people act and then interact with ideas, they, feedback on themselves. The shock doctrine. Vipers finally got it out. Okay. During a wartime crisis, military and political leaders typically take charge. In contrast, a disruption nexus provides opportunity for everyday citizens to organize and take action that can potentially shift governments into a critical decision point, a crisis in the ancient Greek sense, where they feel compelled to respond to an increasingly turbulent situation with radical policy measures. The interplay of the three elements create a surge of political will, that elusive ingredient of change. History tells us that this is our greatest hope for the kind of green Marshall Plan that a crisis such as the planetary ecological emergency calls for. This is not a time for a lukewarm reform or proportionate responses. The crucial problem of our time no longer can be left to simmer on the low flame of gradualism, wrote the historian Howard Zinn in 1966. If we were to bend rather than break over the coming decades, we need rebellious movements and system-changing ideas to coalesce with the environmental crisis into a great disruption that redirects humanity towards an ecological civilization. Will we rise to the challenge? Here it is useful to make a distinction between optimism and hope. We can think of optimism as a glass half full attitude that everything will be fine despite the evidence. I'm far from optimistic. As Peter Frankopan concludes in The Earth Transformed, quote, much of human history has been about the failure to understand or adapt to changing circumstances in the physical and natural world around us, end quote. That's why the great ancient civilization of Mesopotamia and the Yucatan Peninsula have disappeared. I'm not going to... Like, Shane, don't be angry. On the other hand, I am a believer in radical hope, by which I mean recognizing that the chances of success may be slim, but still being driven to act by the values and visions you are rooted in. Time and again, humankind has risen up collectively, often against the odds, to tackle shared problems and overcome crises. The challenge we face as a civilization is to draw on history for tomorrow and turn radical hope into action. Okie dokie. Okay, so we've got a video recommendation. Yeah, cool. Okay, so this was, okay. This is from 20 June 2024, so from like a month ago. Yeah. Might not be too west. Okay, well, that's fine. We're not going to watch it now. But, let's give it a little review. What do you think about this? This is like, this is how we do. The video is Naomi Klein's movie based off her books. Have you done TOS scans of shock doctrine before? Okay. Yeah, so... Here's what we do here. If you're new here, let me know. Like, pay attention. Not let me know. I don't care. Like, you can wave if you want. But if you thought this was fun, made your brain dance, you give it a brain dance. If you thought it was existential or artistic drama, Nog Stream. Deeper ancient ideas, Nog Oro. Technical slicing and dicing arguments, Nog Knife. Nog Naval, if you thought it was only for academics. I mean, there's a public article, so it's not really. Nog Turd for all style, no substance, no poop underneath, and Nog Grapes for big claims that shrivel up. You can always give it the global vote yay, vote meh, and vote nay. So vote yay is thumbs up, vote nay is down, and meh is eh. And I kind of calculate a overall score on that'll be up on a website. Basically, if it's got some good ratings or bad ratings or meh ratings. It feels almost platonically meh. Yeah, I mean, hey, Aerosol, what's up? So it does feel very meh. So I'm going to do a vote meh also. I'm with you guys. So brain dance and a poop. Yeah, I mean, that comes out to kind of a meh too. He indirectly justified violence as in, it seems like you have to make the powerful actually fear for their own lives. Yeah, I was saying that earlier. Like, it seems like you have to light a fire under these people's ass. And it's like that sort of thing. And says it was fine. It was informative to regular folks. Nothing I can argue with against the basic stuff for sociologists. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is basically in this area of like, it was okay. Like, I didn't really like the argumentation, but then it wasn't bad either. They knew what they were doing. It was all kind of a setup. Like, oh yeah, like these are the traditional ways like politics change. And then there is like also this sort of like social movement that can scare people good enough that they get off their ass and do stuff. Now, Aris, the other question is, don't we have to, like, justify violence sometimes? It's like, yeah, I don't think anything actually happens very peacefully in the world. I mean, I'm not out there saying you should go kill people, but, like, the question is, do you get the Martin Luther Kings if you don't have the Malcolm X's? Like, is it, like, just inaccurate to say that we, at all times, do not justify violence? It's a popular article, but I'll say it wasn't really philosophy. He didn't delve into any values. See, I disagree there. I think he tried to do this historical sort of argument that came up with the disruption nexus. That's some shitty analytic philosophy, basically, but still counts as philosophy. Like, it's still just some silly analytic way of viewing the world. And, they had to walk back some of it, too, at the end. But, like, it's like, okay, but they know that there's always, like, this how, if you're doing some sort of, like, historical, political thing, that's just sort of par for the course, and they know that. Yeah, you sort of think a little Kuhn, I don't like violence, yeah. I'm probably too much of a fan for Kuhn, yeah. Mixed on this one, Vipers, yeah. I mean, this is I just gave it a meh. I don't have a whole lot to say. You saw it as an essay for political theory class. Yeah, to be honest, it was fine. Yeah, I mean, they wrote a book where I bet they tried to go into more philosophy about their disruption nexus. But yeah, nothing revolutionary. Yeah. So, which is really funny to say, actually. They're trying to say this is the way forward, but again, they're not offering any real revolutionary ideas. They're just sort of saying, if you scare people bad enough, it's then things happen. It's like, okay, is that like shocking? Yeah. Poli-sci there, not much philosophy. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. But we can do stuff that's on the, a little bit more on the poli-sci side too. Who was this person? This person was, 60 seconds. If you want to get anything else in, grapes, yeah, I'm going to have to give it a grapes too. I was trying to say it wasn't that great, but like bad, but it's not grapes. thing. They walked it back, and they didn't say a whole lot. Maybe I'll give a double vote meh. Because that'll actually, the grapes will drag the score down, but the double meh will keep it kind of like towards the middle a little. It wasn't that bad. Like, it was just not that good either. Something not being philosophy isn't an insult. Yeah, exactly. I'm not angry with it being politics. I mean, they did like a little bit. So yeah, this is the Center for Eudaimonia and Human Fluttering at the University of Oxford, and the founder of the world's first empathy museum. So this is interesting. So this person's, I think, working on policy, it looks like. Yeah. It's just precise about the topics. That's fine. I mean, and there's a lot of overlap in political science and a philosophy of politics. So it's like, okay.